Okay. And thanks to everybody for being a part of the session. I know this is such a busy time in the school year, and especially on a Monday, it makes it especially difficult. So we're really pleased that you could take the time out of your schedules to be a part of the session. I'm Tom Gusky. I am a professor emeritus at the University of Kentucky, coming to you today from my home here in Lexington, and so happy to be a part of this project. It's an ongoing effort that's going to be part of Jefferson County Public Schools for the coming year and extending into next summer, where we're really going to take a serious look at grading and what we could do to make this a little bit better for our students and make tests a little bit easier for our teachers too. I wanted to start, as I have in sessions before, by sharing with you some contact information for me, so that if today's session prompts questions or concerns, that you don't have to wait until our next meeting really to get in touch with me. So here's some of the ways you can. Um, as I mentioned, I am Professor Emeritus here at the University of Kentucky, live in Lexington. I do have a website, and that website is just tgusky.com. If you go there, you can find articles. We'll be talking about some of the issues today. I write a regular blog for Education Week. You can find copies of that there too. There are several reports that we will be talking about today that come from admissions officers, that when you change grading, how does that affect the admissions process and what they're looking for? And all those can be downloaded from the website. If you wish to contact me through email, my email here at the university is just gusky@uky.edu. Those of you who follow Twitter are welcome to contact me through Twitter as well. My Twitter address is just @tgusky. And then there you have my phone number. We'll be sharing this information again when we finish our session today, so that you have this and it will be available to you. We'll also be sharing with you copies of the slides that I'm going to be presenting today too. So if you wish to refer back to any of that material, that'll be available as well. Now, I also wanted to start with two kind of cautions. First of all, I know that many of you were a part of an earlier session that we did where we sort of outlined to school principals some of these basic principles with regard to grading and reporting. Today's session is going to repeat a lot of that information, and for that I apologize. The idea was that we wanted to provide this common knowledge base for everybody, and in discussing how we would structure today, we felt it necessary to sort of go back and repeat or cover that material again so that everybody would have that shared knowledge base. So please be patient with me. I know that for many of you it will be repetition, but we're hoping to make it a lively discussion as we go along too. And second, I need to start with a bit of an apology, because many of you are part of efforts that are going at the elementary level. And I know many of you are in schools where you have already moved ahead in some efforts with regard to a standards-based approach to grading. I'm going to challenge some of the procedures that many schools follow, and I know some schools have already done this within it, because a lot of what we're doing today is going to be based on what we've learned from school districts that have tried to accomplish grading reform and really struggled in their efforts, in many cases failed. So I apologize up front if what I say is counter to what you've already done or suggest a different direction, but I'll try to provide some rationale for that and give some suggestions on how we can sort of bring things back on track. The information I'm going to be sharing with you today comes from two different sources. The first is a book that's called What We Know About Grading. And this is a book published by ASCD. It's an extension of a large-scale project that we initiated with the American Educational Research Association. In 2016, the American Educational Research Association was celebrating its 100th year anniversary. As a part of that celebration, they put out a call to all educational researchers asking if some would volunteer to take on the task of reviewing research in these different areas of education. So with my friend Susan Brookhart, we brought together a team to look at that 100 years of research on grading. It was published in Review of Educational Research. You can download that original article from my website if you want. But then the people from ASCD approached us and said, we really need to translate this into practice. So could you write a book that would talk about the practical implications of that 100 years of research? And so that's what we did. We brought the team together again, expanded the team a bit, and developed this book. So if you're looking for research support for any of the ideas that I share with you today, know that it's all available to you there. The second book is another book that actually all schools and will have a copy of if you don't already. And it's a book called Get, Set, Go. This was an extension of an earlier book that I did called On Your Mark. And On Your Mark talked about what we've learned about grading and what are some of the major issues we have to change. Get, Set, Go is how to get that done. If you had a chance to look at Get, Set, Go, you'll see that it talks a lot about the change process. It's based on an analysis we did of school districts throughout the country that had attempted grading reform and just failed miserably in their efforts. We tried to understand why they failed and if we could anticipate some of the issues that they really found difficult to overcome and really prepare school leaders to deal with those issues up front so they didn't become major obstacles for the reform efforts and the success that you would know. So that's really where you're going to get a lot of that information as well. We'll have a little assignment between now and our next session. It'll be based on 2 chapters from Get, Set, Go. One chapter is chapter 4, which is developing a purpose for grading. And the second is chapter 6, which talks about using multiple grades. I'll give you a little bit more detail of both of those as we go along today. Now, finally, we also do have a sort of set agenda, as we should for any session like this, but we really want this to be an informal kind of discussion. That if as I'm going along, there are questions that you have, if there are concerns that are raised, if there are things that you'd like to clarify, don't hesitate to let me know. We'd like you to use the chat box to do that and just note that question in the chat box. Shalonda is going to monitor that as we go along and she'll let me know. And I've let her know that I'm really open just to stopping and taking the time to go into these issues in as great a detail as you need. So please feel free to do that as we go along. We really want to make today responsive to your needs, as we will with all the sessions we're going to be sponsoring. So with that in mind, we do have some sort of learning targets we'd like to accomplish in this first introductory session today. First, I'd like to share with you a little bit about the history of the research on grading, what we know about it, and what we've discovered in that process. We're going to turn from that to exploring some of the advantages and disadvantages of different grading methods. What I'll be sharing with you is there's no perfect grading method. They all have advantages and shortcomings, but it's really essential that we become familiar with those advantages and shortcomings so we can apply the methods that best suit our purpose. And finally, we're going to talk about some guidelines for developing and implementing more effective grading policies and practices, especially as it regard to standards-based or competency-based sort of grading models at all grade levels. So I hope that falls in line with your expectations. So with that in mind, let's start. What do we really know about effective grading reporting? Well, the first thing that we know is this, that we do have a long history of research in the area of grading. This actually surprised me when I first began investigating it because I was really shocked to discover how much we know, how long we've known it, and how little has found its way into our practice today. And I'm convinced there's just not another area in all of education where the gap is greater between our knowledge base and our practice than in the area of grading. Let me give you an example. I did find this study. These 2 researchers, their names were Daniel Starch and Edward Elliott, were deeply concerned with the amount of subjectivity on the part of teachers that's involved in grading. Now, we know that's always been a problem, but here's the way they chose to investigate it. Starch and Elliott took 2 compositions that had been prepared by students. They made copies, and they sent those compositions to 200 middle school and high school English language arts teachers with these directions. They said, we'd like you to grade these papers. We'd like you to assign a letter grade and a percentage grade to both the papers and assume they came from your students. So use whatever criteria, whatever standards you would use in grading your students. Starch and Elliott got the papers back from the teachers and found tremendous variation in the grades. The grades were just all over. In terms of letter grades, 15% of the teachers gave the papers a letter grade of A, 13% gave failing grades to exactly the same papers. There was every grade in between. In terms of percentage grades, the first paper, the percentage grades ranged from 64 to 98, and the second, they ranged from 50 to 97. So Starch and Elliott published their study. But as soon as their study came out, people began to criticize them. And they said, well, first of all, You chose writing, and we all know writing is a very subjective judgment in the first place. Not everybody agrees on what good writing is, so you stack the odds in your favor. Second, you chose middle school and high school English language arts teachers. And everybody knows they're crazy a lot, and you can't trust them. So why would you expect any different results? So what Starch and Elliott did is they took two math papers and repeated exactly the same study. They sent these math papers to 200 middle school and high school math teachers with identical directions. Assume they came from your students, grade them accordingly. Got the papers back from the math teachers and found greater variation in the grading of the math teachers than the English language arts teachers. A greater spread in the grades. Now, how could that be? Well, what Starch and Elliott found is that the math teachers, many of the math teachers just kind of correct answers because they felt that's what kids would have to do when they took these large scale assessments. But a lot of the math teachers gave partial credit. How they gave the partial credit, though, varied drastically. I mean, some took off for labels, some did not. Grades were all over. Now, I doubt if those results surprise you very much. From the dilemmas that we're going through today, I mean, trying to score and grade authentic assessments and projects and portfolios, it probably sounds familiar. What I think will surprise you is to learn when Starch and Elliott conducted their research. I'll give you a hint, and those of you that were part of a session before know this. This article, this research was published the same year that this was the headline in a newspaper. Yeah, Starch and Elliott published their study in 1912. We've known about this for a long time. And I know what you're thinking. Well, Tom, we've come so far. We can do it so much better today than we could in 1912. Well, there was another researcher by the name of Hunter Brimmy who decided to find out if that was the case. And so what Brimmy did is he took the same composition that Starch and Elliott had used. He made copies and he sent it to 100 teachers with identical directions. Assuming it came from your students, assign a letter grade and percentage grade to it. The one difference was that all of the teachers in Brimmy's study had taken part in a very extensive professional learning program on the traits of writing. They'd been trained on how to score writing samples. His results, identical to what Starch and Elliott found. Percentage grades range from 50 to 96. Brimmy's study was published in 2011. So in 100 years, we haven't come so far. And that leads then to the second point. And the second point is the research then, this knowledge base that we've accumulated through research hasn't had a lot of impact on practice. So what then has? What influences and what really guides teachers in the grading practices they currently use? And that's a question that I often use to prompt any discussion with grading. I'll just ask teachers, how did you choose your grading methods? When you first entered the classroom, how did you decide the way you were going to grade? And actually, we posed that question in a study that we conducted here at the university to over 300 teachers. And let me share with you what they told us, and you can tell me whether it was similar to your experience or not. What those teachers told us was this. They said, there's nothing in our background that gave us any idea how to do it. Nobody talked about it in our undergraduate preparation. Nobody talked about it in graduate classes. And aside from the discussions we have when the district adopts a new online grading program, we don't really talk about it very much in terms of professional development. So what happens is this. We become teachers, we find we have to do it. And most of us reflect back on what was done to us. And in those reflections, we try to come up with practices we hope are fair, equitable, and educationally sound. The problem we have is that often we reflect back on what was done to us most recently. And what was done to us most recently was done to us by college and university professors. Well, if there's any level of education at which almost everything is done in grading is totally evil and corrupt, it is the college university level. But we also found that we often tried to accomplish too much with a single reporting device, like a report card. And that is always a mistake. That when you think about grading and reporting, you can't just concentrate on the report card. You have to think about all the different devices we use to communicate information about student learning to parents to families, and to others. And that's why we never recommend having a report card committee. Instead, have a reporting committee that can take on all these different communication tools that we have available to us. They can look at not only the report card, but also parent-teacher conferences, student-led conferences, email messages, phone calls, open house meetings, all these different devices we use. Now, today in education, we are all using computerized grading programs. Here in Kentucky, all schools are required to use Infinite Campus. Unfortunately, many of our teachers refer to it as Infinite Chaos. And all of these computerized grading programs, there are over 40 available to educators throughout the United States, but they all consist of three basic elements. And here they are. There is a gradebook, there's a report card, and there's the permanent record of the transcript. Now, the gradebook is that recording device where teachers record every piece of evidence they gather from their students. So in the gradebook, you are going to record homework, project scores, quiz results, engagement rates, class participation, majors, exams, everything goes into the gradebook. Now, at regular intervals throughout the school year, teachers are required to summarize that information and record that summary on a report card. Here in Kentucky, nearly all of our schools send home report cards on a quarterly basis or every 9 weeks. And those report cards are supposed to be summaries of that information that's recorded in the gradebook. And finally, we have what's called the permanent record of transcript. Now, the permanent record of transcript is that record that's going to follow the child from school to school. So when a child leaves your school, it goes to another school, that record goes with them. It's the record of their academic performance. When new children come into your school, they bring with them a permanent record. And those summary grades are a part of that permanent record. That record at the high school level is going to form the basis of a transcript. That transcript will then be available to all kinds of third parties. It's a part of the college admissions process. It is available to potential employers. If they're going to military service, they have access to high school students' high school transcripts. Now, the important thing to keep in mind with regard to these is that each of these elements is related. And when you change one, it's going to imply changes in the others. Now, recently, we have been looking at school districts engaged in reporting reform, and we found some classic mistakes that some have made. And let me share some of those with you now. And again, this is going to relate to some changes we need to make within Jefferson County and move in different directions than what some schools have already done. In particular, we must distinguish between the gradebook and the report card. Most importantly, not everything that goes in the gradebook needs to be a part of students' grades. Parents need to know when their children are completing homework assignments or not. That doesn't mean you need to count homework as a part of the grade. Parents need to know how their students are performing on formative assessments. It doesn't mean you need to count formative assessments as a part of the grade. And what too often happens is we make report cards exceedingly complicated with all this detailed information when it is absolutely unnecessary, when parents have all that available to them already in the gradebook. But just because it goes in the gradebook doesn't mean it has to be a part of students' grades. Several summers ago, we had a group of school districts came to us here at the university, and they were struggling with grading reform, wanted to know if we would help. And we said, of course. So we brought them together in the Summer Institute. Now, one of these school districts was fairly well along in their process of implementing a standards-based approach in grades K through 5. And they were looking to transition to the middle school and high school level. The other two districts were really just starting. And so this district that was fairly well along, they had developed report cards for every grade level that indicated the different standards students would be addressing at those different grade levels. At one grade level, on the report card, they were listing 38 language arts standards and 27 mathematics standards. That seemed a little bit complicated. So we did a little study where we actually went to parents and we asked parents, how many ways can you break a subject area down on a report card have it meaningful to you? How many ways can you break down language arts or math, science, social studies? How about art, music, physical education? The response we got from parents was amazingly consistent. In fact, two other groups have repeated the same study since, got exactly the same results. Parents told us no more than 4 to 6. You don't have to list all the standards on the report card. You create a bookkeeping nightmare for teachers, and then you overwhelm parents with information they don't understand and don't know how to use. And more importantly, you don't have to, because parents already have access to the gradebook. The gradebook gives you the detailed information on the standards. The report card should be a summary. Now, how do you construct that summary? There are a couple of ways you can go about it. In some school districts, they are looking to summarize on the report card by developing what they will call essential standards. Some are developing power standards. But we find that number one, that's a lot of work. And number two, everybody does it differently. The key here is that we don't have to do it. You see, in every academic discipline, there is a professional organization of teachers that has already developed standards. And they have organized these standards into strands or domains. And they are an excellent way of summarizing on a report card. Report card should provide that summary in terms of those strands. So in terms of language arts, you don't have to have 38 language arts standards on a report card. Instead, what you can do is break down language arts, as have the National Council of Teachers of English Language Arts. And they have divided English language arts into reading, writing, listening, speaking, and language skills, 5 areas. See, the key is we need to distinguish between gradebook standards and report card strands. The report card strands are really designed to summarize student performance. And so they're going to be relatively few in numbers. They are going to be broad and general, but they need to be clearly understandable, and they need to express in parent-friendly language. The work is already done for us. We just need to be able to report it. The National Council of Teachers of Mathematics has done it for math. The next gen standards have been organized according to that in science and social studies. The Council of Teachers of Arts and Music have done it as well. And so what that means is you don't need a report card that is 10 pages long. You don't need something that looks like this. It overwhelms parents and repeats information they already have in the gradebook. What you need is something that looks more like this. We're going to break it down into these areas. If parents have questions, we can refer them to the gradebook to get the detailed on the standard they're working on. We're going to pull out some process goals. We're going to talk about that in just a bit. Then we can have a description of class comments of what was really the focus on it. And we can have individuals' comments reflecting that student's individual performance. That's number one. We're going to move from all these standards in the gradebook to reporting strands on the report card. And the second thing is we want to disable all computer grade calculations. Built into many of these grading programs is a program, an aspect of it, that as soon as a teacher enters new information, that is used to calculate the student's grade at this time, on this day. In a program called PowerSchool, it's called your GPA. It can be called your current grade. Some even put a little arrow by this grade indicating, does this new information raise or lower the grade from what it was before? In schools where that is a part of the grading program, we find that kids are checking their phones 4 and 5 times a day to find out if the teacher has entered more information. Parents are checking the phone that many times. There is nothing in computerized grading programs that compels students and their parents to care more about grades and more about points and less about learning than that aspect of the program. Turn it off. Just disable it. We are going to tally this information to determine students' grades. We don't want the computer doing it every time a teacher enters new information, because then teachers get reluctant to enter the information. Or if they want to be concerned about how parents are going to interpret it, they can enter the information, put a 0 weight to it. But our information from parents indicates parents don't understand 0 weights in grade books. We want to provide the information, but let parents know, number one, not everything in gradebook is part of the grade. And number two, we're going to calculate the grade and we'll let you know how. We're just not going to let the computer do it until we determine it's time. Those two things need to be part of what we do within Infinite Campus to bring about any success in grading reform. That leads me then to number 3. And the third point is that we don't agree on why or how we grade. And this, as leaders in this effort, is going to be the first major challenge you'll have to face. I often start discussions on grading by asking teachers and the faculty of any school to really sit down and discuss these 2 questions. The first is, why do we do it? I mean, why do we even assign grades to students and use report cards? And second, we know when a teacher assigns a report card grade, they consider a wide variety of sources of evidence. What do you think should count? What should a teacher use to determine the grade you're going to be put in the report card? And we actually ask faculty members to engage in these conversations and see how much they agree or disagree. And what you will find if you engage your faculty in this discussion is we don't agree at all. We are all over the place. Now, fortunately for us, researchers have asked educators exactly these questions. And when they ask the question about purpose, they find that the responses of most educators generally fall into one of these 6 broad categories. I mean, one of the reasons we're doing it is to kind of communicate information about students' performance in school to parents and families. A second is to actually provide information for the students themselves, especially for the purposes of self-evaluation. Now, third, we use grades for the purpose of selecting, identifying, or grouping students into various educational programs. You need to have decent grades just to be promoted from one grade level to the next, and grades are the primary criteria used in determining promotion. You need to have high grades to get into honors or advanced classes. You need high grades to get into college or university. Low grades, well, that's usually the first indication some additional assessment may be necessary to determine if a student has special needs. 4, to provide incentives. Now, people argue about this all the time, but the evidence is pretty clear. What's the first thing students ask a teacher when the teacher announces there's going to be a quiz or assessment? Does it count? And suppose the teacher turned to them and said, no, it doesn't count. Who studies for a test that doesn't count? So clearly there's some incentive value there. 5, we always look at grades when we evaluate the effectiveness of various instructional programs. I mean, if the instructional program is working, we'd hope the grades are going up. And then finally, to show evidence of appropriate effort or responsibility on the part of students. Now, we could argue that any of these are clearly legitimate purposes, but what I often will do is I'll ask a faculty to just rank order these, each individual, from the most to least important of these 6. And then we compare the rank orderings. And what you will find if you engage your faculty in this process is that we are all over the place. That rarely is there any agreement, any consistency in this. And see, that's your first major problem. Because when we don't agree on the purpose, what we try to do is come up with some reporting devices to serve all these purposes. And what we come up with is one that doesn't serve any of them very well at all. You cannot serve all these purposes with one device. It's impossible. In some cases, these purposes are actually counter to each other. I mean, here, to the degree you focus on 1 and 2, you need to be willing to give up 3 and 5. Because if you focus on 1 and 2, what you hope is that all the students do well. But if all the students do well, there's no variation in the grades. And if there's no variation, you can't use it for selection. You can't use it for evaluation. Those 2 things depend on there being variation. And this is the first major challenge as leaders you're going to have to face. We need to reach some consensus on a purpose. Once you decide the question of purpose, then issues about policy and practice become a lot easier to address. Now, researchers have also asked educators about what source of evidence they use when they determine grades. And this is the list that they've generated. Now, again, it would be very unusual to find any teacher who incorporated all of these, because you can see looking over this list that they vary in their appropriateness depending on grade level and to a large extent on subject area as well. But what I often do is just ask faculty to go through this list and just give me a count, a total number of those that they use or would advocate using to determine a student's grade. And what you will discover is that number varies from, in some cases, as few as 2 or 3 to as many as 12 to 15. And what that shows is that not only do we disagree on why we're grading, we disagree on how we grade. And see, that's a major issue that we need to address up front. In recent years, most of the studies that I've been doing on grading have been looking at parents and students' perceptions of grading. And what we have seen consistently in this work is that parents and students' greatest concerns about fairness in grading all come down to inconsistency in the grading practices among teachers in the same school. From class to class, from level to level, everything is different. And it's different because we disagree on purpose. That has to come first. And so one of the things we're going to be outlining for you to take on between now and our next meeting is having discussions about that purpose. Can we come to some consensus about the purpose among the faculty in our building? Now, doing that is not going to be easy. Develop that kind of consistency means agreeing on purpose, and it requires a process of what we call disagree and commit. And with disagree and commit, I'm sure you've heard of this before. It's touted as a management strategy used by some of our most successful corporations. Digital, for example, Intel, Amazon use disagree and commit, where you bring together people with widely varied perspectives who have very different perspectives on these different issues. But what they need to do is recognize that we all are working for the same organization, the same kind of institution, and we need to be consistent in this. And so we need to come together to put all those different perspectives on the table, but then commit to a particular direction, something that we can all agree to, so we can be consistent in this. Now, actually, the history of disagree and commit is much more extensive than this. I mean, it was actually designed as a strategy for planning military campaigns. You probably have seen this old photograph before. This is a photograph of the Allied commanders in the Second World War. And they were brought together by those two gentlemen seated there in the center. They are Generals Montgomery and Eisenhower. And they were brought together to design a plan to invade Europe to try to end the Second World War, right? It became eventually known as the D-Day invasion. Now, when they first met, they disagreed passionately about how to do it. I mean, they were all over the place, right? But after 3 days, they came up with a plan. It meant reaching some consensus. Now, again, consensus is sometimes described as a situation where everybody goes away a little bit unhappy, but they knew they had to work together. They knew they had to collaborate in this. And so they disagreed, but they committed. They committed to working together and really moving in a unified direction. We have to do the same in grading. And it means coming to consensus with regard to our purpose. And so one of the tasks we're going to take on initially, right up front, is defining a purpose for grading for our school. Now, there are 3 questions that you are going to want to address as a part of this. And here they are. When you define your purpose, the first thing you have to consider is what information you're going to include. You're going to have to consider the primary audience for that information. And then finally, how you want that information to be used. Now, in recent years, I've been doing a lot of work with our international schools. You may know that every place in the world that we have an embassy or a diplomatic mission, we have a school. These are coordinated by a component of our State Department called the Office of Overseas Schools. And one of the schools where I've done a lot of work, and they've done a really good job with regard to some changes they've made in grading, is the American School in Paris. And I'd like to share with you their purpose statement. Here it is. Now, they actually print this purpose statement on the top of their report card, so it's clear right from the start what they're going on. So you can see they say the primary purpose of grading is to effectively communicate students' achievement towards specific standards at this point in time. A grade should reflect what a student knows and is able to do. Students receive separate feedback and evaluation on their learning habits, which will not be included as part or included in their academic achievement grade. Now, pretty straightforward. but extremely valuable. And let me point out how very small things that you include in this purpose statement can have a profound influence on your practice. If you look at this purpose statement, one of the phrases that profoundly influence their practice is the phrase, at this point in time. You see, by including that phrase, what they did, they threw out averaging. What they're saying is, we're not going to average anymore. We don't care where you were at the start of the marking period. We care a lot about where you are right now. And what that did is it freed up teachers to be able to give kids latitude in coming to that point where a grade wouldn't have to be determined right at the start. Not everything needed to count. It also freed up kids that they had the opportunity to explore, and if they blew it, they would still have a chance to recover. There wasn't the idea that everything had to count. At this point in time, made a profound difference for them. And we'll talk about other aspects of this purpose statement that you are going to be taking on as a part of our work in this project. Now, next thing we want to consider is to recognize that the appropriateness of any grading method always does depend on the purpose that we decide. And so that's why it's so important to establish this purpose first. Now, suppose that we did this, that we as a group sat down and our faculty went through this process of disagree and commit. And after some discussion, we finally came down to this, that we want our purpose to be this, to accurately and meaningfully describe students' current level performance. Kind of makes sense? I hope so. But if that's our purpose, what I'd like to do now is turn to the most common grading methods, four in particular, and describe to you some of their advantage and disadvantage. Now, before we do, I want to warn you, you need to hold on to your seats because I'm going to challenge some really long-held notions here. I'm going to challenge some of the things that you maybe believed for a long time about different grading methods and share with you some of their advantage and clearly demonstrated shortcomings. And two, let me remind you again, as we go along, if there are any questions so far, if anything has come up, don't hesitate to put it in the chat box. We're going to take some time to address those as we go along. So again, we want to make sure that we're addressing the things you find most critically important. So with that in mind, let's turn to grading methods. Okay. The first grading method we want to discuss, because it's clearly the most commonly employed, would be letter grades. Letter grades dominate American education today. Do you know that letter grades are used today in 87% of American high schools? They're used in slightly fewer middle schools, fewer still elementary schools, but slightly more colleges and universities. And you can see the letter grades are really simply labels attached to categories of student performance. They do provide a brief description of the adequacy of that performance. They're generally understood, or most people think they understand letter grades, but they do require teachers to integrate all this diverse information into a single symbol, which can make interpreting the symbol very difficult. The cutoffs between the grade categories are arbitrary. I'll share with you in just a moment how arbitrary they are. And of all, they are most easily misinterpreted. Now, there are some places around the country and even around the world where we have this idea that letter grades are evil and they are corrupt and we need to get rid of them. We just need to be abandoning them. We need to go gradeless in this area. And this actually took place here in our state when some of the reforms were passed in Kentucky early on. Some of our Department of Education people came out and said that. We don't want elementary people using letter grades anymore. I mean, they're evil, especially primary kids. We don't want letter grades anymore. And so most of our elementary teachers throughout the state developed a different set of labels for the categories of student performance. And most decided to use the same categories to be consistent as we use in our state assessment. Now, you know that here in Kentucky, we have a state assessment that classifies student performance at 1 of 4 levels. So on the state assessment, you can score a 1, 2, 3, or 4, and we have labeled those novice, apprentice, proficient, and distinguished. Now, to be honest with you, I have always found that very troubling, simply because we could not get parts of speech straight. We have 2 adjectives and 2 nouns. We should have stuck with 1. But that aside, the kids don't get letter grades. They get novice, apprentice, proficient, distinguished. The problem is this: that report card goes home, and do you know, every single parent we interviewed translated that directly. Distinguished is an A, proficient is a B, we accomplished nothing. And so if you think by changing the labels, you are changing interpretation, you can forget it. Parents will interpret it exactly the same way. Now, sometimes we take this to one further extreme. You may know that here at the University of Kentucky several years ago, we went through a nasty debate on grading. It was ugly. It broke up friendships. It was a topic of editorials in our newspaper for weeks on end. And the essence of the debate was whether we as a faculty are going to give plus and minus grades. Oh, it was ugly. And at one point, I was actually sort of subpoenaed to appear before our university senate. Someone had did some research on grading. It's just subpoena, you're required to appear for the senate. And I thought, a subpoena, really? I mean, you could have called. But anyway, so I go to the senate, and they said to me, Professor Gusky, what is your idea on plus and minus grades? And what I told them was this. I said, to be honest with you, this is a much simpler issue than you have been debating. Truly it is. It comes down to this. Do you want to have a 5-category system, or do you want to have a 12-category system? That's it, 5 or 12. And if you think more is better, why stop at 12? You don't have to stop at 12. Let's consider grade point 0 to 4.0. Just go to the 10th place. That gives you 41 categories. Oh, and you may think that is silly. Do you know that is exactly the grading system that is used at the University of Washington today? You don't like that? How about percentages? 0 to 100, 101 discrete categories of student performance. But do you know what happens when you increase the number of grade categories? The influence of subjectivity on the grade goes way up. And what that means is the chance of 2 equally competent judges looking at exactly the same body of evidence and coming up with exactly the same grade drops drastically. And I also shared with my university colleagues that in K through 12 education in Kentucky, where we have very clearly defined learner goals, which few university professors have, we have a well-refined student assessment system, which no university professor has. We train people to evaluate those assessments. We sometimes have trouble getting them to agree in 4 categories. They think they can do it in 12? Not a chance. Significant research evidence shows once you move beyond 5, 6 categories that most human beings cannot in any reliable way make that fine a discrimination. But we remain undaunted and move to percentage grades. And you can see percentage grades are numbers that we attach to these very sophisticated complications where we compute for grades through these mathematical algorithms, and we use weighting strategies for it. Supposedly they provide finer discrimination, increase the variation in grades, but they do still require that integration of all that diverse information into a single symbol, increase the number of arbitrary cutoffs, no less arbitrary, just many more of them, and tremendously accentuate the influence of subjectivity. You see, people have this idea that if I have 101 levels of performance, I can more accurately describe student performance, and I can more accurately discriminate between students' levels of performance. And that would be true if we were measuring something directly. We have to distinguish between measuring directly and measuring inferentially, indirectly. You see, if I wanted to measure your height, that's a direct measure. I would have you stand up against the wall. I'd put a line on the wall. I'd measure it using a yardstick. Now, if my yardstick was only marked off in ½ inches, I'd only be able to measure your height to the nearest ½ inch. But if my yardstick was marked off in 1/4 inches or 1/8 of an inch, I'd be able to measure it much more accurately. The more finely tuned my measurement instrument, the more accurate my measure when you have direct measures. But the things we're measuring in school are not direct measures. They are indirect measures. They are what we call inferential measures. I give a kid a series of tasks. I ask them to perform that series of tasks, and based on their performance, I make an inference about the level or the quality of that performance. And when you have inferential measures versus direct measures, those fine gradations become absolutely meaningless. Of all the grading systems we have available to us as educators, the one that is most difficult to defend from a practical, an ethical, or an educational perspective is a percentage grade system. And here are some of the other reasons why. Number two, you just have to think about the scale. You see, in the typical letter grade scale, we've got 5 categories of student performance, A, B, C, D, and F. We have 4 categories of passing and 1 category of failure. This implies that as educators, we are 4 times better at distinguishing levels of passing as we are levels of failure. And that kind of makes sense. That would be defensible. But watch what happens when you get percentages. In a percentage scale, the scale flips. Now I have a scale 2/3 of which denote levels of failure, 60 to 65 levels of failure. Do we need all those levels of failure? Are we twice as good at educators at determining levels of failure as we are levels of passing? Has any student ever argued with a teacher about what level of failure they achieved? I mean, really, can you imagine a student saying to a teacher, you gave me a 42, I think I deserve a 45? Why do we need all those levels of failure? And people say we really don't use all those levels. I think that's great. Then why have them? Have your scale go from 0 to 50, have 10 levels of failure. Are 10 levels of failure not sufficient for anybody? The choice of 100 is absolutely arbitrary. And we recognize this. Back in the early 1900s, when Starch and Elliott did their studies, we recognized that we could not be consistent with percentage grades. A scale with 101 levels of student performance, the average amount of variation among teachers was 10 to 15 percentage points. That's huge, right? And because that was recognized, in the 1920s and 1930s, we moved away from percentage grades. We did. That's when the fewer numbers of categories were used. That's when the letter grade system was developed. 1920s and 1930s, fewer levels of performance because we could be much more consistent in what we were doing. And we persisted with that until we started using computers with grading. And when we started using computers with grading, the people developed computer and grading programs had no idea of this history. They were not educators, they were software engineers. And they liked percentages. They were a lot like money. 100 different levels, easy to divide in halves, quarters, and tenths. And suddenly we saw this resurgence in the use of percentage grades, right? With no educational foundation to it whatsoever. In addition to that, we then start applying the percentages to performance. And it's almost always inaccurate. Because again, with performance, we are inferring a student's level versus being able to really measure directly their level. For example, we've always had this idea that 80% means mastery. If I could just get into 80%, if I just get into 8%, I'd be really happy about that. Well, the problem is that it really depends on the standard. I mean, for example, would 80% be sufficient if you were teaching children to cross the street safely? I mean, probably not. We'd probably want something a little better than 80%, right? How about if you were teaching children to be honest? Would you accept from a kid, you know, today is Monday. Today's my day to lie to you. The rest of the week, I'll be honest, but today's my day off. Well, no, that wouldn't be sufficient at all, right? Would you get on a plane with a pilot successful 80% of the time landing the plane safely? Would you, when students leaving a high school shop with 80% of the fingers with which they entered? No, right? There are other instances, though, in which 80% can be truly remarkable performance, outstanding performance, almost impossible to achieve, right? Let me give you some sports analogies. How many of you like professional football? All right, well, do you know if an NFL quarterback completes 2/3 of the forward passes thrown, a 66% pass completion rate, that would rank that quarterback among the top 5 of all NFL quarterbacks in all of history, a 66% pass completion rate. Like basketball, one of the greatest basketball players of all time, before LeBron, clearly Michael Jordan. Do you know what Michael Jordan's success rate was shooting from the field? Career, 49.7. 49.7. That was remarkable performance. Half the time we put it up, it went in. I mean, I've said before, I have a basketball hoop here in my driveway. I can't hit 50% and there's nobody guarding me. He hit 50% with the best people in the world guarding him. That was truly outstanding performance. Like professional baseball, do you know if a Major League Baseball player could say 1/3 the times they step to the plate, just 1/3, that would rank them among the very best hitters in all of Major League Baseball. Applying percentages to performance just don't work. And then second, it also depends on the assessment, right? I can construct assessment in lots of different ways that pose very different challenges to students. Let me give you an example. Suppose that I wanted to assess a pretty simple concept in social studies. And again, I've shared this example before, but it's a social studies exam dealing with American history and knowledge of US presidents. I could construct that assessment in many different ways using different types of items. Suppose I made all of the items open-ended, what we call constructed response. Here's an example. Who was the 17th president of the United States? Now, this is the classic example of a very low-level question that is extremely difficult. Many people have this misunderstanding of Bloom's taxonomy. The low level means easy. Not really. Low level means cognitive complexity. See, this is just a knowledge level item. It's the lowest level. It only requires recall, remembering information. It's extremely difficult, though. If I pose this question to American high school students today, success rate is less than 10%. Less than 10% of American high school students can answer this question correctly. Now, in many ways, it doesn't make a lot of sense because many people know that Abraham Lincoln was our 16th president. And the president who followed Abraham Lincoln had the same name as the president that followed Kennedy. Both were assassinated in office and both of their vice presidents' names was Johnson. But putting the math and history together is kind of tough. So what I could do, I could change the format of the question. Suppose instead of open-ended, I made a multiple choice. If I pose the question in this format to American high school students, success rate climbs to 30%. I have tripled the success rate on the item, 3 times more successful students just by changing the format. Same content, same knowledge, same learning goal, 3 times more successful students. Now, again, it's multiple choice and there are 4 options. 25% would get it right by guessing. So 30% isn't that great, but still, I've tripled the success rate in the item. I could change it once more. If I pose a question in this format to American high school students, success rate climbs to 60%. And we might assume that if you can't answer it correctly now, you don't know a lot about US presidents, right? I could even change it once more. And under this format, success rate climbs to 95%. Answer D throws off a few kids, and we're not exactly sure why. But here's my point. I can construct assessments with items of any of those 4 types. Would it be fair for me to set the same cutoff for grades on those 4 assessments at exactly the same point? Not at all. They pose very different challenges to students. And do you know who controls that? I do. I am the god of grading my class, and I can make that assessment as easy or as challenging as I want it to be. I mean, I've gone to state officials here in our Department of Education, and I say, you want more kids scoring at the proficient distinguished level on the state assessment? No problem. Let me design the assessment. It's that easy. I just showed you how it can be done. It's absolutely arbitrary. But when it comes to grading, these things have a profound influence. And you see, one of the ways we can make grading easier for teachers is by limiting the number of grade distinctions teachers have to make. This is one of the first things we did when the COVID pandemic first hit. The first thing that college universities did was they limited the number of grade distinctions that instructors and professors would have to make. The most prestigious universities led the way. The University of Chicago, Stanford University, Harvard University, went from a 5-level grading system just to 2. Pass, fail, success, incomplete, right? We need to be able to do the same. We need to be able to defend grades in that way. And so if you look at grading system categories, here are the 5 major ones that exist. Percentage grades, plus and minus letter grades, standards based, and the satisfactory, and complete. With percentage grades, you have 101 different categories of student performance. Plus and minus letter grades, you bring it down to 13, right? Down to letter grades of 5, standards-based maybe 3 or 4, and down to the satisfactory and complete only 2. When researchers do studies where they try to find consistency among teachers, and that is teachers with the same background, the same experience, the same skills, the same knowledge base, looking at the same body of evidence, coming up with exactly the same grade, the cutoff is right here. 5, 6 categories of student performance is about our limit. Above that, reliability really drops. And so that's why more categories mean less reliable, less consistent grades. One of the major things we want to do is to be able to have less categories. And that's why if you want to get kids ready for college and careers, they're not going to face percentage grades in colleges. Colleges don't do that. We don't have percentage grades here. We don't have a report card that reports percentage grades, not at all. This works. This is what we use here at the university. We have numbers attached to grade categories, and whether you use a number or whether you use a letter really doesn't matter, right? They're just different labels attached to the categories. And you can still calculate a grade point average to the 100,000th decimal place if you want, and A as a 4, and B as a 3. It all comes down to be the same. This is actually what we went to here in our College of Education. When we had this great debate on grading, there was discussion about the D grade. Should we really have a D for college level work? You can't stay in college making Ds. You fail making Ds. You have to have at least a C work to get by. The D has always been the gentleman's F anyway, right? So we've eliminated. We have A, B, C, and if we've gone from 5 categories down to 4 categories, the labels do not matter. For all I care, you can use emojis as long as they're distinct. The one thing that doesn't work is this: 101 levels of student performance. And with that 101 levels, then the 0 becomes such a problem, because the 0 is such an extreme score. To recover from a 0 in a percentage grade system requires a kid to fit 9 perfect papers. 9 perfect papers to come from a single 0. Who can do that? I mean, what if the best kids would find trouble doing that? But what we have to understand is the problem is not the 0. Some schools are trying to move toward these minimum grade policies where they say the lowest grade a teacher can assign is 50%. It's still a failing grade, but it's 50% to get out of it, that 0 being such an influential part of the grading system. But what you've got to understand is that teachers get very upset about that. How can you give 50% to a kid who does nothing? But the problem is not the 0. The problem is percentage grades. Get rid of percentage grades, the 0 problem disappears. I give 0s in my classes. And a 0 just means I don't have any evidence. It's a placeholder. As soon as you get me some evidence, I can change that 0, right? But going from 0 to passing a 0 to 1, not 0 to 60 or 65, a kid can recover from a 0. And that's all I'd ask. You know, give the kid a chance to recover from it. And so what this means is that we have to start recording grades according to rubrics and not in terms of percentages. If you look at my grade book for my university students, everything goes in the grade book is A, B, C, D, or F, or 1, 2, 3, 4, everything, a number or a letter, a 4, all right? Now, I have a 10-point quiz. I don't put 9 out of 10 or 8 out of 10 in the grade book. No, I let my students know, okay, these are really important concepts. And so to get an A, you need 9 out of 10. Got to get 9 out of 10, all right? Now, next one, well, I got some latitude here. These things aren't all equally important. So in this one, you get 8 out of 10, that's a 4. I let them know that ahead of time. They know what level of performance they have to achieve. What goes in the grade book? 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And that leads me to the standards-based. And you can see in the standards-based, we also have labels we're attaching to categories of student performance. And if well constructed, it can offer a description of achievement and be useful for diagnosis prescription, but does require extra work for teachers. Because now, instead of a single grade on assessment, I might be giving 2 or 3 grades if that assessment is attaching 2 or 3 different standards. And it may not be supported by the gradebook. Many teachers are having struggling trying to adapt Infinite Campus to a standards-based approach. But one of the most important things we have to consider as we move in this direction are the labels that we use to categorize student performance, because parents interpret them differently. This became very evident to me a couple of years ago. I was invited to go to New Zealand to actually help on their national assessment program. Now, in New Zealand, they have an amazing national assessment program. They classify student performance all based on these performance events they have kids take, all their national assessments performance events. And as kids take these performance tasks, their performance is valued at 1 of 3 levels. So you either don't pass, you pass, or it can be exemplary. So not pass, pass, exemplary, only 3. And they turned to me and said, what do you do in the States? I said, well, we have a few more levels. We have things like not started, just beginning, in progress, almost there, mastered, extended. And New Zealand educators turned to me and said, so let us get this straight. You have 4 levels of not pass. I said, yeah, I guess that's true. And so that really troubled me. And I came back from that. And once I returned, I went around the country collecting labels, how we categorize student performance. And I looked at assessment programs, I looked at grading programs. And this is a list that I was able to generate. Now, you can see that here, 4 seem to be the magic number of categories that we use. And I tried to distinguish between levels of understanding and levels of mastery or proficiency. I'm not sure they're really distinct. But we use labels like modest, intermediate, proficient, superior, beginning, progressing, adequate, exemplary, novice, apprentice, proficient, distinguished. That's our Kentucky model. Then we have unsatisfactory, needs improvement, satisfactory, outstanding, which could be different from below basic, basic, proficient, advanced, below standard, post exam, meet standards, T standard, pre-emerging, emerging, acquiring, extended, incomplete, partial, to partial and thorough, which should never be confused with how often they are able to do it. And that can be rarely, occasionally, frequently, consistently, never, seldom, usually, always, which can be different from degrees of effectiveness or evidence of accomplishment. Is it any wonder that parents translate things to letter grades when we cannot be consistent in labels we use? Now, here's what we did. We took this list and we gave it to parents. And we asked them, are there any that you really like? Are there any that really make sense to you? Unfortunately, nothing came out on top. I mean, parents were spread all over. But then we asked another question, and that was, are there any you don't like? Are there any that really are confusing to you? And there were some real losers here. And again, I apologize to those of you that have already moved ahead in this category, but I'm just telling you what our research evidence from parents indicates. There were 2 here that parents found confusing and did not like. The first was the word emerging. Consistently, parents had problems with emerging. Emerging to them invoked this image of a slimy creature crawling out of a swamp. Emerging literacy just meant the creature was carrying books. Time after time, parents questioned us about emerging. Our response was, well, emerging kind of means beginning. And their response, if you meant beginning, just say beginning. That's a really valid comment, right? The second, the parents did not like was the word exceeds. Over and over, parents told us they could understand how you could have specific criteria for something like exemplary, distinguished, outstanding, but exceeds, it's more than we expect, but we cannot tell you what it is. It's out there somewhere. We think we're going to know it. When we see it, we just have to tell you ahead of time. Again, it lacks communicative value. And this whole process of grading and reporting are much more a challenge in effective communication than they are documenting or quantifying achievement. And if parents don't understand the information we are trying to communicate, it doesn't work, right? Now, this has led us to 2 specific changes. And again, profound implications for work you've already begun in Jefferson County. The first is this, that we have to look at changing the way we develop rubrics. And again, this comes from analysis of school districts that have struggled in this effort. When the standards movement was first begun in the early 2000s, we developed all these standards. We developed rubric to assess student performance on these standards. And the rubric actually describes student performance, describe these levels of quality within student performance. And our traditional approach to doing it was this. We began with our level of proficiency. We had a couple of levels leading up to it. I always had a level above. That was like the exemplary or the distinguished level. And that worked at the elementary level because the level above was always easy to identify. If you're working on third grade standards, it's fourth grade stuff. The problems occurred when we tried to transition to middle school and high school. Because in middle school and high school, the question for students and from their parents is not what I must do to be proficient. Their question was, how do I get an A? How do I reach that top level, that highest possible? And that whole approach just drove them absolutely crazy. And so the new approach we're taking the development of rubrics to go along with our standards is to go back to what Benjamin Bloom told us in the 1970s. In the 1970s, Benjamin Bloom was working on what he called mastery learning. He knew that no matter what he defined mastery to be, people would argue with him about it. But Bloom was also really smart. And what he did was simply turn it around. He went back to teachers. And he asked the teachers, do you give grades? The teacher said, well, of course we give grades. He said, great. Are the grades really based on student learning? Don't tell me you give like A's to the top 20%. Are they really based on what kids have learned and what they've accomplished? Yes, they're based on student learning. He said, fine. Tell me what you expect for an A. I don't have to define mastery for you. You've already defined it. Just tell me what you expect for an A. Make that clear. So the new approach we're taking the development of standards is that don't begin in the middle and go up and down, begin at the top. If getting that top category means working on fourth grade stuff in third grade, that's okay. It's really okay. We just have to be clear about it. We have to let parents and students know exactly what is required to reach that top level, to get that highest category. Begin at the top. Again, it's going back to what Benjamin Bloom told us back in the 1970s. But the new approach we're taking, the development of rubrics that helps ease that transition into middle school and high school, is just start at the top and then go down. If it means describing what you want for an A, and I don't care what it is, I just want us to be clear about it, right? And I know this one's counter. There are schools there in Jefferson County that have based a lot of their work on the Marzano model for developing rubrics. And Bob, a very good friend, Bob describes how you take your standard and then you should have level above that's a bit more cognitively complex. And so if your standard is really dealing with something like application or transfer, then you should have level above that deals with analysis or synthesis. And I said, that's great. I support that. But for many students, you've changed the standard. The standard is whatever you set that top level to be. And I'm fine with that. We just have to be clear about it. The example that I give all the time is like with Olympic archery. Now, I don't know if you saw this on television recently when they had the Olympics in Tokyo, but in Olympic archery, archers stand 70 meters from a target, and they have to hit a target that is just 12 centimeters in diameter. 12 centimeters, that's really hard. At 70 meters, that's really hard. But if you did that, how could you ever exceed that? How can you do better than that? And some might say, well, maybe what we should do is move the archer back to 80 meters. Or maybe what we should do is make the target 6 centimeters instead of 12 centimeters. And I said, that's great. I'm fine with that. But you change the standard. The standard is whatever you set the top level to be. And so if you want them to hit a 6 centimeter target at 80 meters, I'm fine with that. Just be clear about it. Let's let it be known right from the start. That's what we want. And so the idea here in developing standard is begin with your model of excellence and then go down from there. It will ease your transition, especially as we try to move to middle school and high school. And the second aspect of it is this, that we must be able to deconstruct end of year standards to determine grading period benchmarks. And here's why. When the standards movement was first begun, all of the standards we developed were end of grade level or end of course standards. So we had third grade, fifth grade standards. We had science standards. We had biology standards. We had algebra standards. And we were convinced with excellent instruction, when the report card went home at the end of the year, the students would demonstrate their proficiency on those standards. So the report card went home with all fours. And that made sense to us. The problem was the report card did not go home just at the end of the year. The report card went home after the first 9 weeks. After the first 9 weeks, the kids were just starting on the standards. And so we sent a report card home full of the ones and twos. That made sense to us. It did not make sense to parents. Because you see, we're dealing with parents that are trying to impress upon their child the need to strive for the highest grade possible. And to those parents, those ones and twos were failing grades. And we tried to counter that by saying, oh, no. These are end of year standards, and this is where we really want the kids to be at this time. And the parents' question, if my child was having trouble, what grade would you give them? A 1 or a 2? My point is made. I don't know if my kid's on track or my kid's having trouble. And if a kid's having trouble, parents want to know as soon as possible. So the resolution to that and the new direction that many school districts across the nation are taking is they're moving from end of year standards to grading period benchmarks. We're trying to define clearly where we want the kids to be at each quarter. And so where do you want the kids to be at the end of the first 9 weeks? You establish that. And you base the grade on that. We find exactly the same holds true across all grade levels. Establish your quarterly benchmarks and be really clear about that. And see, parents are accustomed to that because parents are accustomed to the possibility of grades going down the second marking period because expectations change in the second marking period. But it does mean that if kids meet those benchmarks, then the report card should go home reflecting that. But it is extra work. It requires us to be clear about what we expect at each of those different levels. And so what this means is that students and their parents want to know if they're on track at this time. And if they are, we need to be communicating that in clear and purposeful ways. That brings me to the last point. Then the last category would just be narratives. And narratives are written descriptions of student work. And you can see that if well constructed, can offer important achievement information and use for diagnosis prescription, but time consuming for teachers to develop, may not communicate adequate progress, and become standardized. Right? That's why so many of our modern computerized grading programs include a menu of comments that teachers can scan through and click the one they want to have printed. Be very cautious of those programs. Do you know that our evidence from parents indicate that many parents found those programs offensive? They cannot understand how different teachers teaching different subjects can offer the same identical word-for-word comment about their child. And I know you're thinking, well, it's unlikely to happen because the menu offers 150 comments. Well, unfortunately, you'd be wrong because people have studied this. And they find that even when the menu consists of as many as 150 comments, teachers restrict themselves to 12 or fewer, the same comments over and over again. And the worst programs, according to parents, are programs that don't actually print a comment, but print a comment number and refer parents to a comment sheet, right? That's the worst. All the parents we interviewed thought that depersonalized reporting process, they really did not like it. And we found the kids making fun of it too. I shared this story before about working in this middle school. And that's the grading program they use. In this middle school, they have a lot of intramural sports and a lot of intramural teams. The kids get to pick their own name for their intramural team. And one of the teams named themselves the D13s. And nobody knew what that meant. Well, then one of the teachers discovered that in the grading program, D13 was a comment, is a pleasure to have in class. Right? So again, and don't get into these battles about comments versus grades. There's a lot of controversy that exists about. Some people are saying only comments, only grades, some mixture of the both. Or no, it really doesn't come down to one or the other. It's far more nuanced than that. I mean, you can kill a kid with comments just as well, and in some cases worse than you can with grades. Now, but we do know this about comments, that the best comments always follow this 4-step plan. And this is true in what you write to kids based on feedback on their performance, notes you give on kids' papers, conversations you have with them, things you write to parents on email messages or telephone calls, anything like this, follow this 4-step process. Number one, always begin with something positive. Start by identifying what the student has done well, right? That leads you into the conversation. Then you can describe what needs to be improved. You want to make sure you pair with that guidance and direction on how those improvements could be made, right? And then finally, you want to express your confidence that the student can be successful. I know you can do this. It's going to be so much better, right? If we follow this 4-step process in all of our conversations, it can lead them to be much more effective than ever before. And see, that's the advantage you have with reporting, is that you can combine these methods in good and exciting ways to enhance your community value. Right? And then that leads me to the next issue. And it's really the last major one that I want to share with you today, because again, this is the major challenge we're going to take on during this coming year. That we want to report always in terms of learning criteria, not norm-based criteria. And this means we're going to grade kids according to what they've learned and what they're able to do, not according to their standing among classmates. You see, all of us at one time in our education or career were in a class where we were graded according to our classmates. We were graded on the curve. And remember how you felt in those classes? Remember how you hated those students who got the highest scores because they blew off the curve? Or maybe you were the one the rest of us hated, right? It doesn't have to be that way. You see, when we grade on the curve, then all these negative consequences follow. That it tells you nothing at all about learning. Everybody in the class could have done miserably. Some did less miserably than others, right? It makes learning very competitive because now the kids have to compete against each other for the few scarce high grades the teacher's going to give out. Helping someone else hurts your chances for success, so it discourages any sense of student collaboration. And it also diminishes the relationship of teachers to students, because as soon as the teacher starts helping one kid, you're not helping all the others. And that means you're interfering with the competition. Now, I know what you're thinking. We don't do that. In Jefferson County, we have moved against this. Nobody grades on the curve any longer. And I say that's great. But let me remind you of a policy that dominates American high schools today, not only in Jefferson County, but around the country, that is exactly the opposite of what I've just described. You know what that is? The determination of class rank and the selection of a class valedictorian. Because we have this idea that that valedictorian should be the person who has the highest weighted grade point average at the end of the senior year. Well, who came up with that? Does anybody even know where that came from? Because I work in an environment, people pay me to figure this out. I cannot find it anywhere. And see, as long as you do that, I can promise you this. The one thing we know happens is the few kids who are in contention begin plotting with their parents when they are in middle school, what they have to do to gain that singular distinction. It has nothing to do with achievement. It has everything to do with competition. It is detrimental to the learning progress of most of the kids in the school. And I know people say, we need to do this because the college universities demand it. Hold on, all right? Do you know of all the fine colleges and universities there are here in the state of Kentucky, there is not a single one that selects their valedictorian that way, not one. All the colleges and universities in this state use the Latin system for their graduates. They graduate students cum laude, magna cum laude, summa cum laude. It's based on a cumulative grade point average over your 4 years, right? Here at the University of Kentucky, if you graduate with a cumulative GPA of 3.75 or higher, you can graduate cum laude. 3.9 or higher, magna cum laude, 4.0 summa cum laude, right? If we have 100 students reach that level, we are very proud, right? Why would we want you to do something we are not willing to do on our own? Now, do we have valedictorians? Of course we have valedictorians. But see, our valedictorians are based on what the true meaning of valedictorian is. Do you know the word valedictorian has nothing to do with achievement? Nothing. The word valedictorian comes from the Latin. It means to say farewell. It's a person's elected farewell address at a graduation ceremony, right? I want us to have graduation ceremonies. I want us to have valedictorians. I just want us to get back to what the purpose is. And if you ask the college universities around this state how they choose the valedictorians, it does differ. In some schools, all the students at the cum laude status get together and they select one from their group to represent them at graduation. At other schools, it's a combination of achievement and service. At many schools, it's a combination of achievement and leadership, often displayed in extracurricular activities. At many schools, including my own, there's a committee of students and faculty who get together and they select a student from the graduating class who they believe best represents the class ideals. See, I want us to have it. I just want us to select them in a way that's more meaningful to students, right? Even if you consider what we do in terms of the admission criteria for college universities, I've been following the National Association of College Admissions Counseling, and they have this opportunity to look at what college universities use for selection. And what they're saying is that we do count grades as important, but they are more concerned with the rigor of the academic program. What we want kids to be doing is taking a challenging curriculum. If you look at this list, you can see that as I've been following this and look at what's going up and what's going down, what's dropped the most is class rank. It's going to be out of the top 10. Because not only are we finding that it's not really meaningful anymore because schools differ so drastically, but we also need to consider what we're doing in terms of enhancing learning opportunity for our kids. Do you know, every school I know that's gone to a system where the valedictorian is selected based on different types of criteria than a weighted grade point average, number one, achievement in the school goes up. And number two, kids start helping each other do well because we've eliminated that ranking system, right? We need to be thinking about what's working, what's not working for kids. Now, I know this is a lot to take on. So I want to take just a brief opportunity here for you to think about the things we've talked about so far and maybe see if there are questions or concerns that have come up, things that you'd like to explore in some greater depth. Because when we come back from a brief break, I'm going to share with you how we do want to grade according to criteria, but we want to use these three. But at this point, we just like to take 5 minutes. We're going to take a short break, come back in at exactly 1:30. We're going to be talking about these things, that how we can make grading more accurate by giving multiple grades instead of single grade. And I'll give you some directions on how to do that. We're then going to turn to your questions and concerns. And finally, we're going to outline sort of an assignment for things we want to take on to prepare for our next session. So let's take a 5-minute break, get up and stretch a bit if you like. Consider these issues. If there are questions or concerns, please post them in the chat box. In 5 minutes, we'll come back, talk about different grading criteria and the next step we want to take in this process. Thanks. Okay, Shalonda, do you think that that's been sufficient? Most people have had a chance to rest a little bit and get back?
That's great. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
Sure. And again, I know this has been, we're sort of, we're piloting different things here. I do have a general rule that I don't like to keep folks involved in a virtual session for more than 90 minutes. That seems to be my limit too for being able to sit and get stuff in a virtual session like this. And so we will try in our future units to take your feedback into consideration and plan a number of breaks throughout, and especially never go on 90 minutes without a break. So we'll make sure that we do it before we go on. There's one final point that I wanted to share with you this morning. Again, our whole purpose is just to establish a common knowledge base for us all that we then can build upon and look for the changes we want to make as at our other meetings throughout the course of this year and throughout the course of this project. We want to provide you a foundation to actually start conversations in your school as leaders there with your other faculty members and the like. We also want to be able to provide a basis for looking at what you've already done with regard to grading and form and how we could change that to make sure we steer things to the right track and proceed in a way that we know is likely to result in the success we want to achieve. This last point is one of the most crucial and one of the things we'll want to really begin thinking about in purposeful ways. And that is, we ended earlier talking about how important it is to grade in terms of criteria. That's certainly true. But there are three different types of criteria that teachers use. And we have sort of gathered those or described those in three major categories of being product, process, and progress criteria. Here's more specifically what they mean. Product criteria culminating illustrations and learning. Don't worry about how they got there, worry about what they're able to do at the end. Process criteria are actually behaviors that enable learning. They don't represent learning per se, but they do sort of enable the learning process. So if you count homework, you're grading in terms of process. If you count engagement, you're grading in terms of process. If you count formative assessments, you're grading in terms of process. And then finally, we have what's called progress. And with progress, you worry not so much about where they are, but how far they've come, sometimes referred to as improvement grading or value added grading. Now, here's what we know. We know that all three are important. All three contribute to success, but we also know they are distinct. And where we get into trouble is when we combine all these three into a single, what researchers call hodgepodge grade, because then it's impossible to interpret. If I said to you, for example, that I was going to take a measure of your height in inches, your weight in pounds, your average calorie intake per day, and number of minutes you spend exercising each day, I'm going to combine that into a single grade to represent your physical condition. You would say to me, that's dumb. I mean, why would you ever do that? They communicate such very different things. And you'd be absolutely right. But you see, every day, teachers take evidence on achievement, responsibility, punctuality, engagement. They combine those in a single grade. We think it makes sense when it really doesn't. The key issue here, and one of the most important improvements we can make, not only to improve grading, but to establish greater equity within grading, is to report multiple grades for these different student learning goals. To move away from combining everything into a single grade, to actually report them separately. Now, I know that that sounds revolutionary, but what's really odd is that if you go to other places around the world, if you go to Northern Europe and the Scandinavian countries, if you go to places in Asia, if you go to Canada and look at the report cards, they have done this for decades. We are one of the few developed nations in the world that persists in this idea of combining everything into a single grade, right? Why do we do that, right? They keep them separate. They'll have an achievement grade, and they can use that for grade point average or whatever that's necessary there. But over here on the side, a separate grade for homework, a separate grade for class participation, a separate grade for punctuality of assignments. Now, when I first saw their system, I said, well, it looks great. It looks like so much extra work. They turned back to me and said, it's easier than what you silly people do in the States. We collect the same information as you. We just don't worry about combining it at the end. And so all those arguments you have about how you weight stuff, how you combine it, we don't deal with it. We keep it separate. The teachers there love it because they find kids take homework more seriously when they get a separate grade for homework. They also like it because if a parent ever questions them on an achievement grade, all they have to do is say, well, look over here. Maybe if your kid started doing some homework, maybe if your kids start participating in class, the achievement grade will go up. Parents like it because they profile the performance of their kids. College universities love it because all grades are carried over in the transcript. And so if you're a admissions officer, would you rather have a straight A student that got there through diligence and hard work or one that got there without even trying? See, I'm not saying one is better than the other. What I am saying is from our schools, we can't tell the difference. From their schools, they can. And I would suggest to you that this is a necessary prerequisite before moving to standards-based. As I looked at schools across our country, I could not find a single high school in our country that had been able to move successfully from traditional to standards-based directly. There are some crucial intermediate steps, and this is the first: multiple grades. Now, I'd like to share with you a report card that does this. This is a report card that I actually adapted from a school district that I found in Canada. And here's the framework of their report card. It's a high school report card. And it's available online, also available in paper format. On the front, there's a front page that describes the school and something about the grading policies and a statement of purpose. You open up on the inside, there are 8 fields, 4 on this side, 4 on this side. Each field corresponds to a class. So in this school, the kids can take up to 8 classes. Each field for a class begins with a photograph of the teacher. They put the teacher's photographs right on the report card. Now, I asked them why they did this. And they say, well, second, high school report card is so impersonal, we just want to personalize a bit. Now, admittedly, when they did this, they also found the number of retakes to teacher photographs quadrupled. So there was some additional expense. But you'll see it, the photograph of the teacher, beside the teacher's photograph, there's the teacher's name and the name of the class. And beside that, there's a band of grades. There's an achievement grade. It's a letter grade. And like I said, that's printed boldly. They can use that for GPA or whatever. Beside that, though, a separate grade for participation, homework, punctuality, effort. And those are numbers associated with rubrics. So the homework rubric, 1, 2, 3, 4. A 4, all homeworks assigned on time. A 3, 1 or 2 assignments missing. A 2, 3 or 5 assignments missing. A 1 multiple assignments missing. And then after that, you're going to see a narrative. The narrative has 2 parts. It has a class part where the teacher describes what the class worked on during the marking period. But the teacher only has to enter that one time. Every student gets those sentences. Then the teacher can add a sentence about the student. So what you're going to see is half the report card, 4 classes. I've adapted it to suit my purposes. I've also included my dream team of teachers. This is what half the report card looks like. Now, here you can see the first period language arts class taught by Miss Angela. And you can see that there's an achievement grade. There's participation, homework, punctuality, and effort. Miss Angela has gone in and she says, this quarter, we focused on poetry in different poetic forms. Students read both well-known and lesser-known poets and constructed their own poems. Now remember, she entered that only one time. Every student got those sentences. But then she added, Chris, after participating in class discussions, wrote several excellent poems, but needs to be more conscientious about completing homework assignments on time. I looked down over this. This kid's clearly got a problem with homework. That's really good information for me to have. And they tell me it's easier than what we do. Now, I cannot tell you these are the process elements that need to be reported. In fact, we've been doing some research in these process elements recently, and we find that they fall into 3 major categories. There are an entire set of process elements that we call learning enablers. And as I described, these do not represent learning per se, but they clearly enable the learning process. There's another whole category of what we call social and emotional learning. And social emotional learning are aspects of student performance that not only contribute to their success in school, but their life afterwards. And then there's compliance. And compliance is to just do what I told you had to do. Here is a more comprehensive list of these 3 types of process elements. And you can see learning enablers, that's where things like effort, engagement, formative assessments, homework, everything like that would fit in. Under social emotional learning, here's where things like resilience and grit, growth mindset come into play. And then there's the compliance. Compliance is, did you do what I told you had to do? At this time, we do not have evidence to indicate among these what is most important for students in their success in school or success afterwards. We're just starting to study that. I mean, there's a center been established at the University of Chicago to look at these non-achievement factors that contribute to kids' success in school and in life. A center's been established at Harvard University to look into social emotional learning. You probably read recently a study was conducted where we asked parents about that. And what we found is parents support it, but they just don't like the name. They'd rather have it be called something like employability skills or life skills. We do know this. You can't do it all. And so this means you're going to have to decide among these what you consider to be most important. Now, this requires, again, another sense of sort of disagree and commit. So in working with the faculty, what I will often do is just present this list. And I would say, here's some of the things you could consider as non-cognitive factors to pull out of an achievement grade. You identify the 5, 6, 7 you think are most important. And everybody will make their own individual list. Then we compare a list. And what you're going to find is the faculty tend to agree on maybe 1 or 2, but then comes that idea of disagree and commit, because to succeed in this, we have to follow these 4 steps. We have to limit it to no more than 4 or 5. Beyond that, it creates bookkeeping nightmares for teachers. So we need to get to 4 or 5, those competencies we think are most important. After we determine those 4 or 5, then we have to have some clear rubric for them. So that if a parent comes to you and says, you gave my kid a 2 in collaboration, how can they get a 4? We can say, here is what level 4 collaboration looks like. Here is an example of level 4 collaboration. And we can actually demonstrate to them what that really means. We need to ensure developmental consistency, because clearly what collaboration looks like in a second grade classroom will be different from a sixth grade class, could be different from middle school and different from seniors in high school. And then we want to be able to describe this in our purpose statement. So again, let me take you back to the purpose statement for the American School in Paris, where they've done this. And you can see this last sentence where they say students receive separate feedback and evaluation of what they call their learning habits, which will not be included as part of the academic achievement grade. And the advantage to this, from an equity perspective, is that you might know that in the past year, school districts saw a tremendous increase in the number of failing grades throughout the country. In Minneapolis public schools, for example, they saw a 5-time increase in failing grades. Salt Lake City, 7-time increase in failing grades. School districts in California, around San Francisco and San Diego areas, similar huge increases. Well, when those educators began looking at those grades and started thinking about these various components that go into the grades, they found that many times these kids were getting failing grades not because they weren't learning, but because of these other non-cognitive factors. And so they began instituting policies of reporting them separately, just what we're talking about here. And what they found is this: when they pulled those out, when they reported those separately, the number of failing academic grades was cut by 60%. 60%. These kids were getting failing grades not because they weren't learning, but because of these other non-achievement factors, in many cases over which they had no control. This is a huge step in terms of being able to develop a more equitable, a more fair, a more meaningful grading system. And the thing that I think is the greatest advantage is it's not a lot of extra work. These are the things we're already doing, but it is also an essential prerequisite to being able to move to standards-based. And you're worried about the college admissions process? Well, you needn't be. You can download from my website a report where they actually went to what's called the Center for the Enrollment Research. This is a center at the University of Southern California that studies the college admissions process. And they ask that center specifically to look into how schools might adapt to a standards-based format where these things would pull out of the achievement grade. And Jerome Lucido is the director of that center, a really, really smart fellow. And this was his response. You can download this from the website. And he said, is a student conscientious? Is a student someone who commits to civic responsibility? Someone who engages in school activities and leadership roles? Is this someone who brings different kinds of students together in conversation and in learning? Is this someone who's not just comfortable with, but learns from different cultures? If there is a way to get at that in a really readable form, wow, we want to know about this. The college admissions people are actually in favor of us moving this direction, right? Now, please keep in mind, if you go back to this report card, this is not a standards-based report card. There are no standards listed here. But what we found is this: but once you do this first, once you move in this direction, once you pull out those non-achievement factors, it makes moving toward a standards-based much easier. In fact, it's almost an evolutionary process, so you want to do that. High school teachers will do this for a couple of years. They'll pull those non-achievement factors out. And then quite naturally, they start turning to one another and saying, you know what? We can break down that achievement grade. We don't have to combine everything into one. We can break that down in these different components. It's a natural evolution to moving there. Now, following these steps can be tough, especially when it comes to developing rubrics. But in our follow-up sessions, we're going to talk about this in greater detail. And I will share with you examples of schools that have gone through this process. And when they struggled terribly with developing these rubrics, what they did, they turned it over to the kids. They actually took it on as a school-based project. The faculty members chose what non-cognitive factors they wanted to include, but then they asked the kids to come up with the rubrics. and they were terrific. The kids were just absolutely wonderful, and they had personal ownership of it because they then developed those criteria. They then were able to say, here is how we could show this to teachers. This is how we could illustrate this. Here's a variety of ways in which it could be demonstrated. They become really owners of it, and they represented how it could be done in very positive ways. Now, we've covered a lot of material in a very short time this morning, and I'm sure that many of you are feeling exactly like this. We do want to take a bit of time now, though, to reflect on these issues and ask if there are any questions. Are there things that came up during the break or during any discussions today that I can clarify for you? Is there anything that I haven't been able to describe in sufficient detail? Or are there questions that this has prompted that you'd like me to go into in greater detail? We'll take some time, if you could even turn on your mic and let us know about those, or jot those into the chat box. Shalana is going to monitor that, and she will let me know about what those questions are so we can try to address those and try to add any detail or additional information might be helpful to you. Sean, if nothing shows up, let me know, and we can just sort of outline our next steps. For
Right now, we don't have any questions here in the chat box,
Okay.
Dr. Gusky. So if you want to go ahead and move on to what they should expect for next steps.
Okay. Well, that's great. Maybe I'm getting better at this than I even thought I was. So thank you. But you know that this is the first part of an ongoing project that we're going to sponsor throughout this year. We're going to be working together, and we are so excited to see so many schools and leadership teams at each of those schools being excited about being involved in the project. And so really looking forward to this opportunity to work with you. We are hoping that not all these sessions need to be virtual. We're hoping that we'll be able to bring folks together in sort of a common setting to share ideas and share perspectives and be able to build on each other's expertise as we go along. But we do want to make sure that we provide for things that are going to be helpful to you. Now, we've set it up in such a way that we have a meeting set up about once a month throughout this year, and we'll be taking different steps. We'll be sending you a more detailed agenda of what we hope to take on during this time. But the two major things we hope to accomplish in this session and provide a foundation for the work is, number one, to be clear about our purpose. We really hope that between now and our next meeting, you can initiate conversations with your faculty to talk about the real purpose of grading. Why are we doing it in the first place? What information do we want to include? Who's the primary audience for that information? And what do we want the outcomes to be? What do we hope they can accomplish with that? And second, to have conversations about those three different types of criteria for reporting. And we're not going to tell teachers how to come up with an achievement grade. We're going to let them determine that. They are the best judges of that. All we're going to ask is pull the non-achievement factors out, and let's report that separately. You know, there's a lot of interest in throughout Jefferson County for reporting engagement indicators, and that's great, but we need to think about how we can do that and how we can do that well. Maybe homework, maybe formative assessments. So those two areas, what do we want to do for purpose, and establishing the basis for moving toward multiple grades, kind of leads me to this notion of what I hope to sort of provide for you in this basic sort of introduction, and that is that we need to start with a clear statement of purpose, and that's going to be our next step. If you have already had a chance to look at the book that we offered on Get Set Go, you'll note that chapter 4 deals with purpose, and so maybe that will be a helpful guideline for you to look at that chapter and the elements that are in you'll see lots of different purpose statements there, including the purpose statement we shared from the American School in Paris. But we want to take these steps to be able to get a purpose statement. And what we're going to do is have each school develop one of their own, but then we're going to bring those together and hopefully look at common elements in those and maybe move to the direction that we could have a common purpose statement for all schools in the district, all schools in the county, to be moving toward that. So we're going to look at each school's individually and see what common elements we share and see if we can't get one that everybody could use. Why are we doing it? Whom's the mission intended? What have been desired to be? The second thing, provide accurate, meaningful descriptions of student learning. And that means that we need to take that grade, that hodgepodge grade, and break it down into these different components. We need to pull out those non-achievement factors, report them separately. We're not going to tell teachers how to complete achievement grade, but we do need to reach some consensus on what we're going to pull out and what things we think are most important to report separately on the report card and also on the transcript. So we hope you will engage your faculty in those discussions as well. Among that huge array of things, what do you think is most important? Again, if you look in Get Set Go, chapter 6 deals with reporting multiple grades. And so that might be a framework for you. If you want to see copies of the Canadian report card that I shared with you, they were reluctant to print it in the book, but on my website, you can go on there and go under resources, there's a drop-down menu, and under articles, you will see an article that we published in Educational Leadership that talks about breaking up the grade. And it includes the copy of that Canadian report card. It includes that detailed list of all the non-cognitive factors. So that could be another example for you. It's a very brief article. You could even download it and share it with your faculty. But that's going to be our next step. Notice that's not standards-based. We're not going to break it down to standards. These are necessary prerequisites to getting there. But what this does is it makes that communication much more effective and much more accurate, much more meaningful, and more fair. This is this primary step to move towards a more equitable grading system. And then finally, then we're going to look at grading reporting to enhance teaching and learning. We want to look at what we're doing already that is working and what we're doing that gets in the way. You know, maybe determining class rank gets in the way. As I indicated, all the schools we know that move away from this and move toward a criterion-based system, a cum laude system. Like I said, I want to have valedictorians. I want us to honor excellence. I just want us to rethink the criteria. Instead of using a ranking system, to use something like the universities use. We want kids to be college and career ready. Let's use those same systems. Let's have a cum laude system that we can use at the high school level. And then have a valedictorian based upon criteria that we set for it. Maybe it can be the student who best represents the class ideals. I want to keep those things. I just want to alter the tradition on how those were established. You see, the bottom line is this, what we're working toward is that grading is not really just an academic exercise. And sometimes the use of infinite campus has led us to believe that. It's also just not a mechanical process. For our kids, grading's personal. No kid ever said, infinite campus gave me this grade. What kids say is, you gave me this grade. And we have to realize how personal it is for our students. And can we take that personal influence we have and do it better than ever before? So we will be sharing with you specific things we're going to take on in our next session, but keep in mind those two things. We want to move ahead in establishing our purpose. We move ahead in thinking about multiple grades, pulling out those non-achievement factors and trying to decide. And so just as we'll be comparing what schools have come up with in terms of a purpose, we're also going to be comparing in terms of the things you decided to pull out and report separately, those non-cognitive factors. And do they fall into the learning enablers, social emotional learning, or compliance? It might be the case that elementary will consider things different from what middle schools do or what high schools do. I'll show you some examples of school districts here in Kentucky that have moved in this direction, what they've done and what they've pulled out. And typically you'll see elementary folks focusing on different things than middle school and high school folks, and that's okay. We just need to be consistent within our school. That's going to be the major issue. And so that's why it's so exciting to have everybody work together to move commonly and purposefully in this direction. The district leaders are really prepared to do this. They're prepared to support you in your works to do this. Michelle, Shalanda, Carmen have been just terrific in working together to get this organized and get the support we need to pull this off. So we're behind you in this effort, and we really want to make it work. So again, if other issues come up that I can be helpful to you, don't hesitate to get in touch with me. We hope that this session provided that foundation from which we can work. Between now and our next meeting, please do have those discussions about purpose and those discussions about multiple grades. That will be the foundation on which we'll build to take our next steps. So thanks so much for giving up your time this morning. Really do appreciate this opportunity to be with you. Hope it's been meaningful. Look forward to working with you for the rest of the year. Michelle, Shalonda, anything you want to add?
Yes, thank you, Tom. Before you all leave, our Assistant Superintendent of Teaching and Learning has some closing remarks for you. While she's talking, I am going to drop the sign in the chat for those of you who have not already signed in. Please wait until she finishes speaking before you complete the form. Once she finishes, you are free to complete that form if you've not already done so, but please give her your attention at this time.
No, thank you all so much, Dr. Gusky. Thank you. We appreciate you. We appreciate all of you taking your time out. This is important for us. We know it was a lot of information in the beginning, but this is to set the foundation. And as Dr. Gusky said before, the next sessions, we have broken those up to elementary and then secondary, so middle and high. So you should have got that schedule from your assistant superintendent. We want to thank the parents that joined us today, those that brought those on for their team. Please make sure that you try to have your full team with you on October the 25th. And we really worked hard, just so that you know, to try to make sure that we didn't interfere with the arrival and dismissal. We do know that that works, you know, some of the time has lunch, but do the best that you can. We will be recording, and we just appreciate you and your patience. And we thank Dr. Gusky and really looking forward to these sessions once a month. If you have any other feedback for us, please share, and we will share that with Dr. Gusky. Dr. Gusky, thank you so much. We will see you all. Please make sure you fill out that the Google Sheet, as Champion Foster said. And we want to thank the district leaders for being here as well, the assistant superintendents and EAs that have joined us. We are here to support you. So thank you so much. And we will get the video and slides to you shortly. Have a great rest of the day. Continue to go forth and do great work.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.